It's a special edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show as we're counting them down, the top 12 shows of 2024. Today and for the following two episodes, we'll start at 12, work ourselves all the way down to the number one show of 2024. So sit back, relax. We're going to share with you snippets of those interviews. Today we're going to get started starting at number 12. That's on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And this is the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. Thank you for tuning in and join us. And thank you those that are regular listeners to the program. We sure do appreciate that. Our loyal listeners for many, many years. You know, since the inception of the Working Ranch Radio Show as a podcast, originally as it was kicked out, we are knocking on the door of nearly 1 million downloads. And very thankful, I should say, of all of the folks that have been regular listeners and new listeners to the program. It's pretty easy to find us out there if you just search in any podcast provider, or you can go to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com. You'll find us and you can find all of the episodes that we've had. Yeah, as you heard there in the opening, we're going to begin the process of counting down our top 12 shows of this year. Now, that's not to say that the other shows that aren't in the top 12 aren't any good to go and listen to. It's not the point. The point is they're also very good shows, and it's not patting myself on the back. It's about our guests and the information that they provide to us that are relevant to those of us in the ranching industry. And the purpose that we started doing this countdown was mainly so in case you missed an episode that you could hear a snippet of that and maybe go back and listen to that. So that's kind of how that kind of came about. And we hope you enjoy today's program as we start at number 12. Also, be sure to listen through the entire show, as later on, the Captain Tim O'Byrne, editor of Working Ranch Magazine, will be in for this week's edition of Tim's Two Cents. I know he's been awful busy too, trying to get the next issue of Working Ranch Magazine pulled together as well. So we'll hear from him later on, as well as meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather. But as we start here today, we're going to start with our show that comes in at the number 12 spot. It was episode 184. That show particularly aired back in September of this year, so just fairly recently, and it was entitled Grazing Behavior of Efficient versus Non-Efficient Cattle on Rangeland. Dr. Jim Sprinkle from the University of Idaho joined us as our guest on that, as he's been a part of a lot of the research that they have been doing on that, trying to find the cow really that matches your environment. That's a conversation that we've had a lot of times with other guests, but really finding that perfect cow that can do more with less, as they looked at different studies and marked out the grazing behaviors of efficient versus non-efficient cattle. And so let's jump in as we start that interview with Dr. Jim Sprinkle. It was episode 184 entitled Grazing Behavior of Efficient versus Non-Efficient Cattle on Rangeland.
You know, it's a challenge nowadays. Cows are roughly 200 or 300 pounds heavier than they were back when I was a kid, and some of those cows have quite an appetite, and that takes a lot of resources to support that type of animal. And we've been chasing weaning weights for a long time, and so as a consequence, the milk production has also increased as the calf weaning weights have increased. So those cows are getting harder and harder to fit into a typical rangeland environment. So back, in the 70s, 80s, Dr. Don Kress and some of his colleagues, they did quite a bit of study on matching the cow to the environment. And at that point in time, a cow that would fit a lot of the rangeland environment would be about 1,000, 1,100 pounds, and they would have moderate milk production and 15 to 18 pounds at peak milk production. And nowadays, we're pushing 1,400 pound cows, and we're pushing 25 pounds of milk production. And so at that state, when they did their study, they looked at the rainfall of the West and different what would be needed to support that kind of cow without providing a lot of extra feed resources. And at that point in time, we were within the bubble of fitting a lot of these cows, but now we're just on the bubble of not fitting the environment. And, you know, this is something that I think most people recognize, but just not a lot has happened in meeting that requirement of cows fitting the environment. And I think There are a few breeders that are doing that, but I think by and large, calves are sold on pounds. Bulls, replacement bulls, people, when they go buy a bull, they want to get a bull that has a lot of growth. And so we're in that cycle where it's just harder and harder to make profitability. Dr. Lawman down at Oklahoma State, he looked at some of that old data, and it's almost a wash for the amount of extra pounds of calf weight that we're getting out of these extra heavier cows and with the higher milk production. And when you run the economics on it, it's really difficult to justify.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Sprinkle, let's start us from the beginning of how this kind of evolved over the years and where we're at now at the University of Idaho with looking at these animals and classifying them as efficient or inefficient, and kind of how that started to where we're at today.
So when I came up here to Idaho in 2015, I spent 20 years in Arizona at the University of Arizona. And when I came up here, we had a bunch of females that had been through the Grow Safe units here, where they look at residual feed intake for feed efficiency. And very little has been done with those type of animals on rangeland. Most of the studies that are published are with feedlot animals. And so it was a real opportunity for us to do something. And so we've been looking at the adaptability of the efficient versus inefficient animals on rangeland. And of course, the efficient animals, they would consume less feed for the same level of performance. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of bulls that are sold in various parts of the West and throughout the country on residual feed intake and their performance with that trait. I'm not saying that's the only trait that you should select for, but they are classified. So we did some of the first studies. The very first study we did, we just looked at some cows that were almost 3 years old, and we had them on sagebrush steppe pasture over by DuBois, Idaho, and we did not provide them with any protein supplement. We put some collars on, but we also looked at their performance, and when we started, it was about a 78-day time period, those inefficient animals tended to have a little bit more body condition than the efficient animals right after weaning. But by the time we pulled them off of there, they had lost considerably more weight, the inefficient animals, than the efficient animals. And so from that, we surmised that, at least with those non-lactating animals, that their maintenance requirements did not seem to be as great out on rangeland. So then we wanted to look at lactating animals. So the next study we did was down at a range unit we have down near Haley, Idaho, Sun Valley area. And we had 2-year-old cows that we were looking at, and we had 12 of them that were efficient and 12 of them that were inefficient. And we repeated that study for 2 years, and we found some pretty remarkable things, I think. The first thing we found was that when the temperatures were mild early in the spring, those inefficient animals grazed longer than did the efficient animals. They have a greater appetite, and so they spent about 1.7 hours longer per day grazing. But as soon as it got hot, those inefficient animals did not do that anymore. So what happened was that in the springtime, they would start grazing a little earlier and graze a little longer into the morning. And when it got hot, they didn't do that. But what they did do is they spent more time resting, laying down in the heat of the day. And then when we looked at the GPS data, those inefficient animals did not climb as high in the pasture. They spent more time down lower in the pasture, closer to water. And so what we attributed to that to was just more heat increment, more heat load on those animals that have greater appetite. So, I mean, you can think about it this way. You put a 454 engine into a truck and you compare the amount of heat generated by that versus a small V8, and there's a big difference. And so there's a big difference with these animals that have higher intake. They have to have a higher or bigger GI tract to support that intake. And so it generates heat. It's an advantage in the wintertime. It's not an advantage in the summertime. that's some of the main findings on that study. So then we looked at some gene markers, and we found that we didn't tie it to efficient versus inefficient, but we found that we could explain about 50% of the variation in how steep a slope they used with those gene markers. So we can predict that some of these animals that are climbing higher in the pasture, we can use those markers to help identify those animals. We're not the only ones that have found that. They found the same thing at New Mexico State. Mm-hmm. So some other things that we found with these efficient versus inefficient animals is there's a difference in how they graze. Those inefficient animals, because they have that greater nutritional demand, they tend to do more search grazing. They wander more as they're grazing. They're looking for the better quality feed. The efficient animals are more purposeful about how they graze. They just get in, get the job done. And so we would find that on a lot of days that those inefficient animals would be grazing about an hour or more per day. Walking an hour more per day than was the efficient animals.
And we're going to cut in here, as that is the first part of that interview back in episode 184 with Dr. Jim Sprinkle, Beef Extension Specialist at the University of Idaho. And that episode was entitled Grazing Behavior of Efficient versus Non-Efficient Cattle on Rangeland. And as you heard there, some of the research that they have been doing and what they have been finding on that. In addition, when you go and you listen to that later on, we'll talk about some of the other information that they found as they identify some of the behaviors, cows that aren't matched to their environment, how they are behaving versus the cattle that are. And of course, what we're talking about more than anything is some of these cattle that are getting pretty heavy in weight. So I encourage you to continue to listen throughout that episode. Again, it was episode 184 that aired on September 28th of this past year. That's the show coming in at number 12. Coming up after this break, we'll get into the show that come in at number 11. It was on a topic that's a little controversial in our industry, so we'll talk about that next. This segment today, though, brought to you by Barn Owl Cameras. Yeah, that's what we use here in our ranch operations, with a northern place that we can keep an eye on a water tank up there, or a set of fuel tanks or corrals or various things like that. Also here at the home place, we can keep an eye on the hay yard and different things that we're just not at every time, all the time. And it's really about just peace of mind, knowing what's going on all the time. You can build your off-grid camera systems today. If you go to their website, you can find out more. They're always running different specials. Check out what they've got now going on. barnowl.tech is the website where you can find all the information that you need for Barn Owl cameras. Are you tired of putting the wear and tear on your ranch pickup, or your good side-by-side out checking stock tanks or reservoirs? Or maybe it's just keeping an eye on a remote ranch location. When you stop and you think about it and you start to calculate the cost of your time, fuel, and miles on your vehicles, you're going to scare yourself. But there really is a very simple and a reassuring solution, and it's called Barn Owl. Barn Owl off-grid cameras and smart alerts provide you that assurance, and there's no question it is a time and a money saver. From anywhere at any time, no Wi-Fi or power needed. Build your off-grid camera system today at barnowl.tech. Real-time awareness starts here. Always know with Barn Owl. Sitting here with my Cowpuncher coffee cap on, and I was thinking in the meantime that if you are needing an idea for someone for Christmas this year, might try introducing them to Cowpuncher coffee, or maybe you try it out for yourself. Not only do they have a great different variety of different types of coffee, whether you want it ground or whole bean, but also through this holiday season, they do have some flavors as well. They're Cowboy Christmas holiday blends, things like hazelnut, cinnamon spice, along with chocolate and mint flavor, just to name a few there. So check them out online. Give Jim or Trish Williams a call if you want more information there. You can find contact information, or go to their website. You can order directly from their website at cowpunchercoffee.com. Grab a mug. Let's spur the day with Cowpuncher Coffee. Well, as we continue counting down the top 12 shows of 2024, we'll move on to 11 here in just a moment. But I did want to mention maybe some honorable mention shows. We did a show back in August 3rd. It was things to consider on using TMR mixers from rookie to expert. That was episode 177. A great show there. If you've thought about or using TMR mixers and not quite sure, that's the show to go back and listen to. One we recently did back in October is a good show as well. Added protein to your cow's diet. Is it worth it? That aired on Saturday, October 19th. It was episode 187. A couple shows you might want to also go back and listen to as well. Here's the show, though, that came in at number 11. It was episode 185, and the controversial topic that we covered a bit in our industry that's been a little bit of a sticky subject from time to time is mRNA vaccines, what you need to know. As Dr. Lou Strickland out of the University of Tennessee, who's their extension veterinary, joined us to talk about that. Not only talking about the fact that it's not being used in the livestock or in the cattle industry, but also we talked about different things, what it is, pros and cons, concerns, also addressing a false narrative in its relation to the COVID vaccine. So let's jump in now as Dr. Lou Strickland from the University of Tennessee is addressing the misnomer out there that it was being used in cattle.
And actually, one of the county agents contacted me. He sent me a video of I don't know who this person was. They were before some sort of committee carrying on about how cattlemen are required to vaccinate with an mRNA vaccines in our cattle, blah, blah, blah. And of course, complete falsehood. And that's when I put out some of my information, saying, yeah, mRNA vaccines are being researched, but there is not an approved cattle mRNA vaccine.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about that, just a little bit further, and let's describe for folks what it is. What is an mRNA vaccine? And of course, those are all acronyms because M stands for messenger, and then RNA, of course, is ribonucleic acid. So let's go through and first describe, what is it?
Okay, just to go over and just kind of differentiate real quick between vaccines, our conventional vaccines, which have been used for decades, are vaccines that have to be cultured. Whatever pathogen that the producer or veterinarian wants that animal protected against, that pathogen has to be cultured. That takes time. And then that's put into the vaccine that's given to the animal. The animal then has an immune response to it and builds antibodies. Well, with an mRNA vaccine it's quicker to be able to develop because they can simply take a subunit of that pathogen and then it's put into the vaccine. And then what that does, as it goes into the system, the cells inside, whatever animal you're trying to protect, have the messenger RNA. And they go out and they see this subunit. And messenger RNA is very, very similar to a carpenter or a contractor. They're given a blueprint. Okay, then they take that blueprint and they go build something by that blueprint. Well, that's exactly what mRNA does. It's basically a blueprint that tells that mRNA, okay, here's a subunit of a pathogen. I need to build some antibodies against it. It goes out there and builds the antibodies, and then the mRNA is gone. It's done. His job is done. He's over. I'm completely gone away. So that's what an mRNA vaccine is. And the advantage of this mRNA vaccine is that it can be built in a short amount of time, as opposed to the conventional vaccines, which have to be cultured over months.
Okay. Now, of course, when we talk about mRNA vaccines, that really came to light, when we went through the pandemic because the COVID vaccines being an mRNA type vaccine. And I think that's where some of the concern that people have is regarding that all of that came together so fast that not quite sure what the repercussions would be for the uses of that.
Yes. And I think that's where a lot of people have concerns in that they think it's the COVID vaccine. I've had some people even tell me they think that because some people wouldn't take mRNA vaccine or COVID vaccine, they're going to give it to the cattle and then you consume it. So there's a lot of misinformation that's going on out there. I can easily see where people get concerned thinking that that's what's going on, but that is not what is going on at all. So once again, the misinformation gets out there, people get all concerned, but that is not what's going on. It is simply being able to come up with a vaccine that is a quickly produced vaccine that can protect our food supply because there's foreign animal diseases that we do not want in this country. And swine flu is actually in the Caribbean right now, and we don't want that in here because it's something we've never had before, and that could easily wipe out our entire food supply real fast. So that's why research is going on to be able to develop these vaccines so that it can be quickly implemented if we do see that problem here in the States.
Let's talk about one of the questions that you've gotten quite a bit, and it has come up regarding the concerns of mRNA vaccines, and that is, does it change the DNA composition of the animal?
You are correct. That is a question I've gotten quite a bit, and I think there's a lot of concern over that. I want to kind of go back and hammer on exactly what mRNA does. It's that messenger that comes from the cell. It's given instructions to go do what it's supposed to do, and then it's gone. It literally creates that subunit or creates those antibodies that the immune system can then respond to if they see that pathogen down the road. But this does not change the DNA composition of the animal. It just simply gives that mRNA instructions on what to go do. It goes and does it, and then the mRNA goes away. It's done. It's gone. It's done its job. But there is no DNA change whatsoever in that animal.
You hit on something I want to just kind of maybe go a little bit further on in specific diseases. Let's hit some of them that really are the big targets that they're looking at with this type of vaccine technology.
We have diseases that we've kept out of the United States that have been eradicated for decades that we do not want back in here. And I'm just going to pick foot and mouth disease because that's one that's been eradicated for decades. And that's one that the USDA is constantly monitoring our borders, our food supply to make sure that does not come back into the United States. And that's where, that's what we talked about earlier, is if all of a sudden somehow that got in, we would be able to develop that mRNA technology vaccine for foot and mouth to quickly vaccinate our animals to protect our food supply.
Dr. Strickland, as you were talking about that, it brings to mind we've kind of got two issues sort of coming head to head regarding this topic in general, because we can say, well, we need to develop this vaccine for these diseases that could enter in the country, yet at the same time, there's a lot of folks in the industry saying, well, we need to control the borders too. We need to control the cattle or the imports and that kind of stuff coming in. So we have two issues kind of coming into this particular deal. And those that are definitely far and against this type of vaccine would say, we really need to get a better control on our imports and labeling. And I guess you see the dynamic that I'm talking about here. And we've kind of got two different issues, totally maybe unrelated, but related.
I think I would call it more related than unrelated. I often talk about biosecurity when I'm out talking to producers. I do quite a bit of cattlemen meetings where I go out and talk to cattlemen's groups. And biosecurity is always a big topic that I always like to bring up. And I often use the adage, if you don't want to fall in the ditch, well, stay away from the ditch. So a big challenge that we have right now, and I get both sectors exactly what they're saying. Better protection for our borders, better biosecurity, having this vaccine technology, but they're both management tools to put in our management toolbox. And
again, that was Dr. Lou Strickland out of the University of Tennessee, their extension veterinarian, joining us for episode 185, our 11th ranked show in our top 12 for the year, entitled mRNA Vaccines, What You Need to Know, as we had good discussion about that vaccine technology, why it would be used, how it would be used, even some of the concerns or issues about the use of it, but also having good conversation about some of the misnomers or false narratives that surround that conversation as well. So again, that was episode 185, mRNA Vaccines, our 11th ranked show for 2024. Stay with us. Coming up, we'll get into our 10th ranked show for the year. It's in regards to a particular state here in the United States that we focused on, and we'll get into that coming up after the break. This segment, though, today brought to you by Safety Zone Calf Catcher. And here's the captain, Tim O'Byrne, with more.
Hey everybody, Tim here. We're fixing to come up on 1 million downloads of our Working Ranch radio show podcast, which is really exciting. And it got me to thinking about another viral moment that we had back in 2017 when we ran a short Facebook video of the Safety Zone calf catchers. And it was so popular, it got 6.8 million views in the first 5 days. I want you folks to check it out, Safety Zone Calf Catchers. It's a great product for all producers. Keep you safe when you're working with baby calves, especially for old timers like me who maybe can't outrun those cows anymore. Check them out, Safety Zone Calf Catchers.
Calving season is a favorite time of year, but along with that special time are dangers, extra stress, and increased labor. Safety Zone Calf Catchers are all about safety and making processing new calves easier. Designed for ATVs or UTVs, one person can do the job and never be threatened by the protective mother cow. Make this and every calving season safer and easier with a Safety Zone Calf Catcher. Watch videos and customer testimonials or order yours today at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914. Affordable and made in the USA. Make your upcoming and all future calving seasons safer, easier, and stress-free. Durable and designed to work anywhere you can drive your ATV or UTV. Order online at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914 today.
As we're doing the top 12 shows of 2024 throughout this last year, I was looking down through some of these shows as we do cover nutrition from time to time. In fact, one of the honorable mention shows I mentioned earlier was episode 187 about protein for your cow's diet. Also, one that we had that was episode 170, chasing that elusive second calf. Had a lot to do with making sure those cows and those bred heifers, trying to get them bred back as 3-year-olds. That nutrition is very important. And this time of the year, nutrition is always important as well, both ahead of calving and post-calving. And if you want to improve your herd's health and simplify your feeding routine, have you thought about using Smart Lick low moisture tubs? They're the answer that can do that. Self-fed, weather-resistant, and convenient, Smart Lick is packed with everything needed to balance your diet for these cows, support their weight gain, and improve productivity. Smart Lick, it's not just another tub. It's a dependable way to get results. If you want to find out more, find out who their dealers are around your neck of the woods, you can go to their website at smartlick.com. That's smart, L-I-C.com. Well, let's continue on our countdown of the top 12 shows of 2024 as we are on to number 10. It was episode 161 that aired on March 30th of this past year, entitled, What Does Kansas Have to Do with Your Cattle Operation? As Matt Perrier with Dell Banks Angus and also host of the podcast Practically Ranching joined us to talk about that. He's a fifth-generation rancher out of Eureka, Kansas, but he walks us through the history of the Kansas cattle industry all the way back to those iconic Kansas cow towns, to the expansion of the railroad, then the arrival of the Black Angus in the United States, the Kansas City stockyards and the packing houses. And we also talk about the evolution of the Kansas cattle industry since the early 1900s to what we see it today. And it's a state that, in fact, has every facet, large scale, I should say, of the beef industry inside its borders. And it doesn't matter what part of the country you're from. You might be surprised to learn in this episode what the state of Kansas has to do with your operation. Let's jump in and listen to part of that episode 161, our 10th ranked show for 2024. So as we move through that era, that time frame of about 1856 through 1896, when we saw the historic cattle drives in that era really being the crux of the cattle industry, and it was really centered, really nationwide centered around the state of Kansas itself. As we talked about a bit ago, the railroad was a part of that. But that railroad went east, and that was a big part of that, because what also was established in there was the Kansas City stockyards, and that in itself was a pretty key thing as part of this industry as well.
Yeah, it was huge, and I, of course, was born too late to be able to see the stockyards in action, but have heard my dad and especially grandfather talk about going up there to Kansas City to watch cattle sell. And of course, a lot of times they'd even actually get to ride the train car with those cattle after they got them loaded from Eureka area on up to Kansas City and see the commission men sell those and then go on to usually go on to Chicago and points east, as you said. But yeah, it was a huge opportunity because of our central location, and honestly, kind of bridging the gap from the early 1900s to today. It's kind of remained that because of its proximity to a lot of different areas, whether it be metropolitan centers and where our beef is consumed, but also feed resources and things like that. We've built feed yard industry and processing plants and everything else that continue to make Kansas kind of a hub for the beef industry.
Mm-hmm. Nowadays in our industry, we hear things like, well, we got wheatgrass cattle. Well, that's a terminology that sprouted out of your part of the country of Kansas there in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I think that when we have cattle, we have options. And that's the neat thing about running ruminant cattle that can graze just about anything that we put in front of them and still convert it into high quality protein. And whether that is wheat pasture, like you talked about in south central Kansas and north central Oklahoma, or whether it's Flint Hills grass, and every year is going to be a little different thanks to moisture and drought and weather conditions and even markets telling us whether we need to pull those cattle forward or let them stay out on pasture a little longer. I mean, there's a lot of diversity within the management of these operations, and I think that that's historic. I mean, you go back to that time period you're talking in the early 1900s, we were somewhere between 10 and maybe as many as 40 years after the Homestead Act. And so ingrained into most of these people's mind was that if you want to own land on the frontier throughout the Midwest and the West, you have to prove that up. You have to show that you can you can make that an economically viable business. And in Uncle Sam's eyes during the Homestead Act days, that means you have to grow something from the ground other than grass, which in this immediate area was very unfortunate that they tried to till up this native grass, because even to this day, the true native grasslands that they couldn't plow up because there were so many rocks and not enough water, et cetera, are way better grass country than those that they tore up in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and have now been planted back to grass. They've never been as productive. And so, man probably screwed up a pretty good ecosystem here through the Flint Hills. But cattle were not their primary source of income. It was crops.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about what we see in regarding the scope and size of the Kansas cattle industry and its impact or its implications to our U.S. size and scope of our cattle industry.
Well, Kansas is obviously a leader. I think we bounce around between second and third nationally on total cattle numbers. Today, I think, or the last January 1 inventory report, we were somewhere around 6.2 million total cattle on ranches and in feed yards. But the feed yard industry is a huge part of it. Most of those feed yards are in the central and western part of the state. Most of the cows would be from the central to the eastern part. And so for those that aren't familiar with our geography and demographics, the arid, drier, lower rainfall part of the state would be in the western third, and they would also have the Ogallala Aquifer and some wells and things that they can pull from, irrigation that they can grow wheat and some corn and things like that. Eastern side of the state, there's not much, if any, groundwater. It's all surface water, but that's quite often where the cows are. And especially like we talked about through the Flint Hills and areas like that is where we would graze a lot of stocker cattle and yearling cattle. We'd also have, several of the larger packing plants. 3 of the 4 would have at least a processing facility in Kansas. And so that would be a huge part of our business as well. And so I think there's a reason, as you look back in the recent history of a lot of these models that would put several segments of the beef industry together, whether it be in ownership or just for vertical coordination. A lot of them have started in Kansas because you've got the genetics providers, you've got the commercial cow-calf providers, you've got the graze and wheat folks and the grass guys, and then you've got a very, very thriving feed yard and processing industry as well. And so we all go to the same meetings. We're all in each other's backyards, and it just makes sense that we can kind of collaborate a lot in those regards as well.
Matt, is there something that we haven't talked about that people wouldn't know about Kansas, the cattle industry? I mean, we've sure talked about a lot of things, but I want to make sure, because I think every state has maybe some little gems of things that they are part of the industry that maybe other people don't really realize. And maybe we've talked about a little bit, but we didn't expand on it enough. Is there anything like that we haven't hit?
I think probably one of the most valuable things, we touched on it before, is simply the fact that we represent all of those production segments. And within sometimes a few dozen miles, if not a few 100 miles. And I think that enables us, when we can see both that operation in a different segment and the people that are doing that and either buying those cattle or feeding those cattle or processing those cattle or whatever the case may be, I think it makes it easier for Kansans to understand the need to collaborate and understand the need for all those cogs in the wheel. Now, we don't get to see the white tablecloth restaurants maybe in New York City or Chicago or wherever the case may be very often, but I think all other segments, we get to see those in action, and we understand, just like you said, how much we need that wheat farmer in South Central Kansas to get enough rain that there is a demand for those lightweight cattle. On the other end of the spectrum, how badly we need to make sure that that feed yard or that processing plant or whatever else has a product that will work for them, make them a profit, so they'll come back and buy ours the next time. So I think that's the neat part. It's kind of a microcosm of the beef industry right here within one state border.
And that was Matt Perrier, our guest for episode 161 that aired back in March of this year. What does Kansas have to do with your cattle operation? Fellow podcaster himself with his podcast, Practically Ranching, but full of a lot of great information about the state of Kansas. And I didn't get at the very beginning of our conversation, there wasn't much in our snippets here today, talked about the early days, the history of the Kansas industry. Very fascinating, great conversation with Matt on that. I encourage you to go back and listen to that. Episode 161, What Does Kansas Have to Do with Your Cattle Operation? That was our 10th ranked show for 2024. Coming up after the break, we'll hit our last one for this episode, number 9, as we focus on the younger generation ranchers. Find out what that is when we come back after the break. We're now on the show that ranked number 9 in our top 12 shows for 2024. But before we talk about that one, I do want to mention that it was with our guest, Alan Crockett, who's been a regular contributor of the show from time to time. And there were a couple other episodes that we had with Alan throughout the course of the year that I'd throw into definitely the honorable mention category. Back on in November, we had an episode with Alan entitled Starting with a Clean Slate. That was episode 189. And then back in June, it was episode 173, entitled Caution, False Prophets in Higher Markets with Alan Crockett. So I'd encourage you to go back and listen to those. But this particular episode, this was episode 191, entitled The Foundations for Success as a NextGen Rancher. Let's step into part of that conversation. Your thoughts when I say, what would make me, as the NextGen Rancher, a better operator in the future?
Leave. That was worse for you, but not, go someplace else and get some experience someplace else for a couple of years. And that can be across the state. It can be a state away, a couple of states away. I mean, it could be a nation away. I mean, you can go to southern Mexico, go to Australia, or go someplace and get some experience where people do things different than the way they are done in your area. Because anytime we look at places geographically, there's kind of an unspoken set of rules that this is the way we do things here, whether that's southern Arizona or whether that's Wyoming or Alabama. It doesn't make any difference. But geographically, we all have the tendency to kind of do things the same way in a geographic location, whether that's how much hay we feed, whether that's when we calve, how we manage our grass. And so I would encourage people just to leave and get away and go someplace else and get some different experience.
Mm-hmm. What about maybe a young couple that has graduated, they've maybe worked a couple ranch jobs, but yet for them, what do you think would make them better managers as they look down the road?
I think getting experience with somebody that is a good manager. As you know, I used to teach the Ranching for Profit School. I'm no longer involved there, but to me, that's a good school, and it's been called the business school of ranching. So learn some business things. If all we learn to do is a different way of management, well, that's fine. That's a good start. But if we're going to be successful, and this is for anybody, not just a young couple starting out, but even older couples or middle-aged couples that are maybe struggling or whatever, if we're going to be successful, we've got to run a ranch like a business, because it is a business. So understanding those kinds of things, I think, is huge, because
the bottom line is, and I don't want to say this in a derogatory way at all, but people that can go out and brand a calf or move cows or doctor a sick animal, they come a dime a dozen. And again, I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory way, but people that can look at ranching from a business perspective and really make good business decisions, those people don't come a dime a dozen. Those are a little far and fewer in between. So get some business experience. And some of that is, sitting down with a good business man or woman, and that may or may not be in ranching, but learning some business skills and then being able to take those principles, the business principle, and apply them to your own operation. That to me is what separates the men from the boys or the girls from the ladies, or however you want to word that. But that's what makes a big difference, being able to make those decisions and see those numbers and understand them and make competent decisions that will move the business forward.
I want to go just a bit deeper because as you and I were talking before the break, I think even, and I'm going to almost put that in ahead of this to what we talked about in the last segment, and that is getting to a point to where you're a person of integrity. You're a person of honesty, of that you're running it. As you and I were talking about as an example, is run it like you own it. If you had to pay for that pickup, if you had to pay for that machinery or whatever that might be, but that all kind of comes in there together, because I think that in itself is going to give you that ability then to take, once you have those business skills, you're going to be unstoppable.
Absolutely. But the personal integrity, you're right, it has to come on top of that, because if we don't have that, obviously we're cheating ourselves, but we're cheating others, we're cheating our community. I mean, if we don't have personal integrity, and that could be a simple thing that it's hot outside and I'm going to go check waters, but I don't want to because it's too hot, or it's snowing outside and I should go chop ice, but I don't want to because it's too cold out. Those kinds of things, or, well, I don't feel really good today, I think I'll just take the day off. That's where personal integrity comes in, that I'm going to go do those things, and I'm going to take ownership of the stewardship that I've been given, whether that's a small stewardship or a large stewardship, but take complete ownership of that everything that happens in that stewardship is my responsibility and it falls on me and the buck stops here. And when we get to that point in life where we really do that, then I think we start seeing miracles and things start happening that wouldn't normally happen. I had a client one time, and he was an absentee owner, and he had some neighbors that were farmers that were taking care of his place for him. And he made the comment, he says, they're not the most competent when it comes to ranching and, grazing and taking care of cows, because they really are farmers. But he says they are people of integrity and they're honest as the day is long. And he says, I know a guy in my area that is very, very good with cattle and that, but he has a reputation of not being honest. And I would rather have honesty and try to teach competency than have competency and try to teach honesty. And I think he nailed it. So absolutely, personal integrity has to come into play. And that's, to me, that's ownership. And if you know a correct principle and you choose to not live it, to me, that's a little lacking on the personal integrity side. So,
Alan, one of the things I want to wrap up with our conversation with you talking through this, and we had talked about it as well, and this could really hit a variety of folks that are listening, whether it's the next gen ranchers, maybe it's those that wanting to expand, whatever that might be, or it's even mom and dad, the decision makers on the place. But write it out. Put what you want out there.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you say that. Put it out there to the universe. Get on your knees and pray about it. Put it that way. And let the powers that be know that, hey, this is what I want, and I really want it, and I'm ready to work for it. I'm ready to make it happen. And when we do that, it seems to me that doors open, and we just have to be wise enough to see the door that opened and take advantage of the open door without taking advantage of people, and have pure motives and do things with integrity. And I think when we do that, there are way more opportunities than what we would see normally.
And that was just part of that conversation that we had with Alan Crockett back in episode 190, entitled The Foundations for Success as a Next Gen Rancher. it was applicable to those that are NextGen ranchers as well as those that are on the current ranch right now running the operation. I encourage you to go back and listen to that one. That was our number 9th show in the top 12 of 2024. Next week, we'll continue on working our way down for the next 2 episodes all the way to number 1. Coming up after the break, the Captain Tim Wilburn stops in for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents, and we'll hear from meteorologist Don Day.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the WeatherStationExperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit MeasureRain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to MeasureRain.com.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. Justin, we are just pedal to the metal on the Jan-Feb 2025 issue. 2025? What the heck happened to our lives? I never thought we'd ever show up at 2025 and not being like riding hoverboards or whatever. All right, so here's 2 items from our Friday Facebook post, which always goes swimmingly because I love it when you folks post what you're doing out there. No nonsense or innuendo or any rhetoric. It's just, what are you doing out there in cow country today? And I got this one. It's posted from a sale barn someplace in the Midwest. 71 head of 438 weights went for $4.71. I said $4.71, folks. That's $2,063.11 per head, 438 weights. And then I got another one here that says, one came right behind it. It says, must be contagious. Hats off to Winter Livestock in Dodge City, Kansas. On Wednesday, they sold 119 steers, 372 pounders, at $496 a hundredweight, setting a new nationwide record for 3 weights. This sale surpassed OKC's West's Tuesday record of 34 steers, 339 pounds, selling at $4.80. Wow, folks. That's absolutely fantastic. That's the hottest calf market I've ever heard of. Item 2, we mourn the passing of Dr. Robert Miller. He was a very good friend of Working Ranch magazine. We used to run all his cartoons in our e-newsletter. We did that for years. He was a fantastic gentleman, a great horseman, and he really left a lasting contribution. Rest in peace, Dr. Miller. Back to you in the booth, Justin.
All right, thanks, Captain. Appreciate the update there. And yeah, like you said, this market is absolutely storming right now. And for those that are getting ready to sell or haven't sold in the big fall run and going to be selling here anytime, or these weaned calves later on, probably going to be looking pretty good. Fortunately for us, we're one of those that's just getting ready to sell calves. So fortunate to be there. But nevertheless, it is a good market, has been a good market. Looks like that we'll continue to see that. Well, let's turn now and take a look at our long-term weather. Standing by is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, as you and I were talking before we went on air, it just seems like the same part of the country just keeps getting more and more winter. And that's kind of reflective more of kind of the northern tier stretching maybe back into Montana, but that northern tier all the way through the northern Corn Belt and the Great Lakes and the Northeast.
Yeah, if you look at temperatures since December 1st, there's a lot of real estate in the central and eastern parts of the United States that's had a colder than average December. And when you're colder than average in December, you're cold. Yeah. And that is a trend that's going to continue here for a little bit longer. We are going to see more salvos of cold come out of South Central Canada into that part of the U.S., at least for another week or so. Now, there's going to be some interruptions. Mm-hmm. As these Arctic waves come through, you always have a rebound before the next one comes on through. But the northern plains, you mentioned eastern Montana, really eastern Montana through North Dakota. Then as you get into Minnesota, Wisconsin, eastern Nebraska, Iowa, then into those northwest Corn Belt areas. Then you get into the Great Lakes in the Northeast. There's pretty impressive snow cover already on the ground, and they're going to get more, while the Rockies to the West Coast, it's been a very mild December, as these cold air masses need to be deep enough to climb that higher elevation, and you need the right jet stream pattern to get that cold air in the western United States. But this is a pattern we've seen before, where the Arctic air slides out of central and western Canada, kind of on an east-southeast track. Eventually, that pattern will change, though.
Okay. So, and I know last week we talked a little bit about some new European models or some new models coming out that was showing where we were going to start to see some transitioning taking place, the time of the year we'd start to see that. Give us a little bit more detail on that.
Well, the position of where the jet stream has been rather stagnant for many weeks in a row, which is off the West Coast or right along the West Coast. And that is something that the long-range modeling back in September and October was hinting at. They also hinted that eventually that high-pressure configuration was going to start to be more in the Pacific than right along the West Coast of Canada, the U.S. And that's important because the placement of that high-pressure ridge is going to direct where the cold goes. And so we've seen that happen. So what we've seen happen is if the ridge of high pressure is along the West Coast, the coldest part of the U.S. is going to be in the central and the east. With the migration, the potential migration of that high pressure ridge more out into the ocean in January and February, well, that's a signal that the cold is going to be more for everybody, more for most of the U.S., including the West, going to have episodes of colder weather. And we're seeing that still, very persistent signal. And so it looks like it's going to maybe start between Christmas and New Year's is where the shift is going to start to occur. And then as we get deeper into January and February, I think a lot of long-range forecasts that have been maybe a little too warm are going to start changing their tune a bit. We've already seen that here in the month of December. I'll tell you that the month of December, a lot of the modeling for the central and eastern United States was a total bust. Total bust.
Yeah. Well, and I know the continental divide is something we always bring and talk about, and it really is, and it kind of makes sense as you were talking today. As long as that high is over, west of the continental divide, it's pushing all this cold and storm east, and there, of course, there's that little bit of area off the continental divide where it's a buffer zone, and then we really see it, and that's definitely what we have sure been seeing.
Yeah, without a doubt. And if the high pressure ridge goes more to the west, the deeper Arctic air masses that can climb the higher terrain of the Intermountain West is when you start to see the cold air spill into that part of the world. And that also includes the desert Southwest, which has been very warm and dry as well. And you'll start to see more weather into that part of the country. So between Christmas and New Year's and after the New Year's, when I think there's going to be a lot of winter weather coast to coast to be dealing with.
Okay, appreciate the weather update here this morning.
Sure thing.
And like Don said, it is going to be a changing weather pattern here for the next several weeks and through these winter months. So if you want to stay in tune with what is going on, you can check in each and every morning on his daily video podcast. You can find the link to his YouTube channel at dayweather.com. Well, as both the captain and I mentioned at different times in the program here today, the next issue of Working Ranch Magazine is in the works. And if you need another idea for a Christmas gift for someone, I'm just full of Christmas gift ideas. How about a subscription to Working Ranch Magazine? It's even better than the Jelly of the Month Club that Clark Griswold got in Christmas Vacation. Yeah, subscription to Working Ranch Magazine. It's always full of great articles and stories, pictures that are very relevant and applicable to those of us in the ranching industry. Check it out. You can go to the website at workingranchmag.com and you can start a subscription for someone right from there. Quick thank you to our sponsors here today: Barn Owl Cameras, Cowpuncher Coffee, and Smart Lick. Not just another tub, it's a dependable way to get results. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. Now, if you'd like to get a hold of me, you can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Be sure to tune in next week, same time, same place. Leave us a rating and review. We appreciate that. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.